Before we get started, I'd like to introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kelly Rosh, and I'm a senior manager at Accenture, an active Spring 2021 Centurion, and this year's Centurion Spring Class DEI co-chair. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this year's Kansas City Centurions and Chamber of Commerce Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Symposium. This year is incredibly special, as this is the first year that we have had the opportunity to open registration to the broader members of our Kansas City Chamber, outside of the active and alumni classes of Centurions. And what an immense honor it is to have you all here with us today. We have an incredible and insightful 2 hours planned for you today, as we explore this year's theme of where do we go from here? I would be remiss if I didn't recognize how broad and encompassing that question is. After all, 2020 left each and every one of us wondering what we would do next as we entered this new year. And many of us still have burning questions ringing in our minds. What do we do with the lessons of 2020 and the painful reminder of social and economic injustice in society? How do we heal the deepening emotional and political divides in our society? How do we take what we learned in 2020 and use it to fuel a better future for our sons and daughters, and even for ourselves? And maybe the most poignant of all, how do we each take what we learned in 2020 about ourselves, as many of us sat in our pajamas or yoga pants, looking deeply in the mirror at who we really are, who we've become, and understand what we have to change within ourselves to create the equitable future that we all deserve. Last year, I watched Kansas City newspapers celebrate that we were no longer in the top 25 most segregated cities in America. And on the surface, that sounds great. But in reality, according to a Brookings Institute analysis of census data, Kansas City now ranks 27th most segregated amongst 51 cities with a population of 1 million or more. But do we really understand what that even means? Kansas City's Segregation Index was at 59.5, meaning that almost 60% of white people in Kansas City don't live near a single Black person. And even when they do, those neighborhoods are still over 80% white. I don't know about you, but I don't think that's something to celebrate. Kansas City, we still have a very long way to go until we see what true equity means. As our committee was building today's agenda, our goal was that each of us can walk away a little more educated, more informed, and with more tools in our tool belt to make real and lasting change for our metropolitan area. Looking ahead at what today has to offer, I will momentarily hand it over to Greg, who will introduce our keynote speaker. From there, we'll break out into focus groups where you will have the opportunity to dive into one of 4 key areas: COVID-19 and the impact it's had on communities of color, creating allies through chaos, education, and finance and economic development. Finally, we will conclude by coming together again as one, where my co-chair Davin Gordon will walk us through our call to action and closing. I hope you enjoy this 2-hour adventure you're about to embark on, because I know that if you listen with an open mind and an open heart, you will walk away with renewed perspectives and hope for what the future can hold. Please help me welcome Greg, who will be introducing our renowned keynote speaker.
Good morning, and thank you. Thank you, Kelly. My name is Greg Valdivino. I'm the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Greater Kansas City Chamber. And this morning, it is my honor to introduce my friend and mentor, Dr. Andrea Hendricks. As Executive Director of Diversity, Inclusion Strategy, Dr. Hendricks leads Cerner's global diversity and inclusion efforts in over 26 countries and the US with 28,000 associates. In addition, she is a member of the Human Resources Leadership Team. She is making an impact on Cerner's culture by driving strategy and engaging initiatives that foster organizational learning and enhance corporate diversity and inclusion vision for Cerner associates, leadership, and community collaborative partners. Dr. Hendricks is a graduate of Kansas State University, where she earned a Bachelor of Science in Human Development Psychology and Mass Communications, and a Master of Science in Student Counseling Psychology and Personnel Services. She has also earned a doctorate of educational psychology and policy analysis from the University of Missouri, Columbia. She also has received a certificate of diversity leadership from SHRM and Yale University. Over the years, Dr. Hendricks has presented numerous workshops and seminars on diversity, student success, and leadership development. Recently, she became an author of a new diversity and inclusion book titled The Big Journey, Bold Inclusion for Greatness. She is working on a second book, this time a children's diversity book. She serves on professional and community organizations and received numerous awards for her leadership and work. Please help me welcome Dr. Andrea Hendricks.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much. I am honored to be with you this morning to share my thoughts around diversity and inclusion, and more importantly about best practice and next practice, where we go from here. I am so honored to see that the Centurions, I am a Centurion alum, doing great things in this space. Hats off to Greg and the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce for continuing to push and hold the crucial conversations for success. So continue the journey. I enjoy your 2 to 3 hour symposium today. And again, I am honored to be here. So let's get started. I have some opening comments that I would like to make first, and then really get into key nuggets for success. You know, what are we moving from and where do we need to go in order to be successful in this space? So I'm going to give you my vision of the past, the present, and certainly the future. So here's a few points to get us started for today, and then I want to poll you and then leverage that poll a little later on in my remarks. I first would be remiss without giving shout out to any Cerner associates who are on the call today, or even Centurion alums. We're doing a lot of great things to onboard diversity and inclusion, and I joined the organization 2 years ago. So this is kind of my second year anniversary, and I'm honored to be a part of 27,000 associates in 26 plus countries in the US who are really committed, along with the CEO, the executive team, and our CHRO HR team, to do more, move the needle in diversity and inclusion. So I want to give a shout out to Cerner Corporation for advancing and being a part of this effort as well. So as I continue doing some research on what does it take to make an organization inclusive, and certainly diversity and inclusion, I want to share a couple of points with you to kind of make sure that we stay focused on that. Inclusive organizations today are much more high performing and agile than ever before. Those that are investing in diversity and inclusion really focus on some top dimensions of success, not only for organizational success, but also for associate or employee behavior. Openness, they're more open to others and to ideas and to innovation. They have advanced equity and equality initiatives for all. And they really get at a concept that I'm going to talk about even more so around belonging. Some other top attributes in the research from Bernson, McKinsey, Diversity Inc., Diversity Best Practice, Korn Ferry, all talk about those organizations who invest in diversity and inclusion absolutely have high trust, have access to resources. Associates and employees really feel good about having access to the resources that they need to get their job done. In addition to diverse ideas related to teaming and related to engagement. So I would encourage you, if you haven't done your homework around what makes organizations effective in diversity and inclusion, I would encourage you to lean in and lead from there. The last thing that I'll share, recently, Glassdoor did a study with individuals who were looking for new careers. And they asked them the top 5 or 10 things that they were interested in when they were on their search. And one of the things that resonated really well in the top 5 was that diversity and inclusion was a part of the organization's mission, vision, and values. And that when they went out to their search engines and they looked at their career sites, they wanted to also see whether or not diversity and inclusion was reflected in that process. And so 67%, what we know, millennials are absolutely engaged in diversity and inclusion, and they want that as a part of our organizations as well. So we're learning a lot about diversity and inclusion today. I encourage you to continue to lean in your symposium and really think about exciting steps in the right direction as we value this journey. We move the needle from now to next. I think it's so important. So let's get started. So I'd like to start first with a poll. If we could go to the next slide, please. I'm going to give you 3 questions, and in your room, you have a facilitator that's going to guide you through the 3 questions. And then later on in the presentation, we will certainly review and reveal what the poll states. So the first poll question that I have for everyone is, I fully understand corporate diversity. So this is an individual question, you as the person, the employee, the associate. It's either yes or no. Do you fully understand corporate diversity? Corporate diversity efforts are a little bit different than community diversity efforts. And so either answer yes or no for that. Okay, that's the first question. The second question that I want you to respond to is, do you have a diversity office or a leader that is driving your efforts within your organization? So a defined office and or a leader that's driving your efforts for diversity and inclusion, and that's either a yes or no. And then the final question that your team lead in your room will ask you, I have high cultural intelligence, I have high CQ to navigate. So I have high CQ, cultural intelligence to navigate across cultures. So do you feel really good and confident that you can work across borders, across communities, across cities, across regions, globally? Do you feel that you have high cultural intelligence? Yes or no? So I'll give you just maybe 30 seconds. Hopefully the individuals in the room are guiding you accordingly. And then in just a moment throughout the presentation, I'm gonna ask to reveal those results. So I'll pause for a second on those 3 questions. Thank you, Renee. Can we go on to the next slide? So I'd like to start with this slide. We must remind ourselves always there is still much work to do. And headline news is a great place to reflect on the good, bad, ugly, and awesome related to any theme in the media, but more importantly, around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I hope that all of you throughout your journey, as you're doing research, is to take time to look at headline news and read those as it relates to local, regional, national, and even global as it touched this space, in order for us to really understand true context of where we live and work in the United States, and some of you may even travel internationally. We must understand what is happening across our communities to be effective in this area. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It's a challenge for you to stay informed and stay connected, as many times we have seen and heard individuals say, well, I didn't know this was happening and I didn't see it. It's not in my community. I'm not sure I'm aware of this. Take time to look at headline news, and you will become more conscious in this effort to understand the plight and maybe even the opportunities that are before us that we need to address. The next slide talks about diversity and inclusion from a historical perspective and continuum. I oftentimes talk to individuals who really believe that diversity and inclusion only started, 20, 30 years ago, and that it doesn't have a historical context in our US history, more importantly, and it does. And so when you look at this image here and you think about the continuum of how diversity and inclusion really became a part of corporate community perspective, you have to go back to what is deeply rooted and seated in our culture. And so individuals spend a lot of time looking at race and inclusion or identity, heritage, and culture to really understand how we can embrace our past and be transparent about it, and then move forward with future context. I'm not going to take you down a history lesson today, but I want to share with you there are several stages in this journey and in this history, and it allows you to have a solid understanding and knowledge if you're going to increase capacity in your role as a leader, as an executive, or even as someone who truly wants to be a diversity champion. You must have solid understanding in these stages. What happened in the mid 1600s to 1920s around race and racism and institutional, systematic, and individual areas around that was on the rise. What happened in the 1970s around affirmative action and EEO, and then bringing us all the way up to 1975 to 1980s about multiculturalism, corporate image, a social responsibility to today. And even beyond, today, many companies are addressing cultural intelligence. They're addressing equity, belonging, and intersectionality, allowing individuals to bring their whole self to work. There's a whole movement, Dr. Crenshaw, who coined intersectionality years ago, about the multiple intersections that we have in our lives. Some are women, and some are LGBTQIA, and also a millennial, and also another dimension of diversity and inclusion. And to be able to understand that we have multiple intersections that may be a part of our corporate platform. So I would encourage you, again, another nugget that I'm giving you, where do we go from here? We have to start with understanding our past and then the historical continuum in order for us to move forward to better ideas, better opportunities, better next steps. And so the next slide that I have really talks about things that are keeping CEOs and executives up at night. And years ago, when diversity and inclusion onboarded, 30, 35 years ago at some companies, they really focused only on diversity. They didn't have a wide scope perspective about diversity. Well, today, these are the things that keep HR leaders up, executives up at night. And these were the 10 merging trends that kind of came out about 2 or 3 years ago. And so I would encourage you to really, as you think about your backyard and think about your corporate world and industry, are you looking at diversity and inclusion from a comprehensive perspective? There are multiple intersections to the work that we do that includes local initiatives and issues, as regional initiative issues, as well as global. And so it's much more comprehensive than maybe 35, 40 years ago of what leaders are addressing in the workplace around this space. So I'm, again, not going to spend a lot of time on this. I think Greg and team will give you a copy of the PowerPoint deck for you to delve deeper, but it's important that not only do you reflect on the historical perspective and continuum and understand how it's rooted in our culture, but you also need to see how expansive it is and how comprehensive it is. I always tell folks, we don't have time for pilots and phases anymore. We're playing catch up to many other communities and corporate organizations. We really have to have a broad pill approach and a wide understanding about the things that impact this area. So moving on to the next is, when we think about, where we go from here, we have to move from something. You got to, in a point in your journey, if you're going to go somewhere, you have to move to something else. And I want to share with you some things that I believe we all need to move from in order to get to a new state, the next state, or the best practice. So the first one I mentioned briefly, but I want to really spend some time on this because I think it's important from a corporate culture that we understand a couple of things. Bias and microaggressions, and we must move from bias, and everyone has bias, all of us born with bias, but we certainly have an opportunity to understand it better, and to be managers, executives, and leaders of companies, we have to mitigate and minimize as much as possible. It is pervasive. It is, looking at how we favor our own in-group more than another group, and it is a mental construct. Individuals who truly behave in ways that prevent people from being included or successful or a part of the team really have learned this and practiced this. It can be unlearned, but it's hardwired and it's very difficult. I mentioned earlier about the individual racism or bias, or the institutional and systematic racism and bias that is really a part of our communities in corporate America. And the more that you understand how it's defined, the better, again, we can begin to move from those areas. So I encourage you to spend time with your teams and in groups to talk about what's preventing us from, where do we go from here, from getting there. Sometimes the roots of bias, sometimes the roots of microaggressions in the workplace are preventing this. So recognizing these three areas can really help us form different ways of existing. The next slide, please. So here's another theory or principle that I think is important. We all hear about this. Everybody talks about the iceberg principle or iceberg theory or model, and this is very popular, but it really gets into system thinking, how people think as a part of systems. It's a tool designed to really look at patterns of behavior. And if you look over the years and you take the historical continuum, we've just seen over and over decade, patterns of behavior and system thinking that is preventing individuals from succeeding in a diversity and inclusion world as we would hope it to be. So we have to have an understanding of the supporting structures, the mental models that are above and beneath the surface. If you look at the left-hand side, that's the iceberg model that we always see. It's a small iceberg. Even the mass below the surface is typically small. It's not that big. You can get around it, build a bridge, take a different boat, take a different means of transportation, you can succeed. That this iceberg on the left really talks about the values, the behaviors, the things that we're aware and unaware in our process. But if you did research and you asked people of color and maybe even women and those in the LGBTQIA communities, what is their iceberg? The iceberg on the right is typically what comes up. And there was a study done years ago, I think 2002, where they had a session where they asked people to write on a card, what would be below the surface on your iceberg. And the mass is so large, as you can see in this picture. 90% of the iceberg is below the surface. And so if we're not going beneath the surface and we're only scratching the surface to address DE&I, we will never move the needle, and we will never be able to go from here to somewhere else in this process. So I think it's so important that we examine what we mean by what we see versus what we don't see. People see that we have verbal things and microaggressions and graffiti and insensitivity and jokes and things like that in the workplace or even in our communities. They don't see the disparate impacts as much. They don't see the limited access to resources or transportation or redlining or educational disparities that are preventing individuals from having a seat at the table. So I would encourage you to think about the iceberg principle and theory to help us come up with better mental constructs in order for us to go from here to where we want to go in the future. The next slide, please, also is a great visual. Many of you have seen this before, but typically when you see this, it's missing two pictures. And I've added those two in because I think it's so important for us to know. Equality versus equity versus social justice. They mean different things. So when you're developing your diversity plans, when you are engaging with your board or your C-suite or executives, you really have to have a true definition. Diversity, equity, and inclusion all mean different things. And so here on this picture, you skip over reality. We always skip over reality. We go right to addressing and working on a solution, working on a problem. And the first picture is an amazing picture of individuals who go to a baseball game and they don't have equitable access or equality opportunities to attend the game. And I'm not going to spend time covering each one, but the images assumes that everyone benefits from the same thing. The images assumes that we all are given the same support to make it a great experience or a great opportunity for all. We must look at how we're treating our workforce, our community with equality, with equity, and then how do we get to social justice and liberation, which is fairness and freedom for all, where we don't have barriers, where we don't have limited access that prevent individuals to get to the next step. So all three of these perspectives, or the reality perspective, the equity perspective, and the liberation perspective, all need some level of support, and we need to be mindful of that. We have to remove the obstacles, build critical partnerships, look at fairness, look at how we are having opportunities that are impartial for all. So if you've not really spent time with this image, it is a great way, a great tool to use in your leadership training development area to think about the difference between, are our practices and policies equitable? Are our practices and policies opportunities for fairness and justice? And you have to walk through all lenses, and we have to address all. So I share this one for those of you who haven't seen it. It's a great way to have a conversation of breaking down and having a conversation and focus groups around reality versus equity versus equality versus fairness and justice. The next slide, please. So now what I'd like to do, I'm not sure, I need maybe in the chat or section, are we ready for the poll? I'd like to see who is in the room, and if I can get Renee or someone to send me the information related to the chat. Let's go through the questions. So if you remember, the questions were, and I'll read them again as they're preparing the final drum roll. The first one is, I fully understand corporate diversity and inclusion. The second one is, do you have a diversity and inclusion officer leader in your organization? And the third one is, I have high CQ cultural intelligence. So we have the questions from Greg, and I'm going to read those to you, the responses. So first of all, thank you for participating. This is great for you. The first one is, I fully understand corporate diversity and inclusion. For those attending, 36% said yes, and 64% said no. Okay, on the first question, 36% said yes, and 64% said no. Number two, the second question, diversity office versus our leader driving it, and it's almost even. 53% of you said yes, and 47% said no. And then the last question, do I have high CQ cultural intelligence to navigate across cultures? 60% of you said yes, and 40% of you said no, and that's really great. And I'm gonna spend time on the last one real quick before we move on. And thank you guys for those of you that are team leads that help pull this together. Cultural intelligence is one of the new areas, and it's been around for 15, 16 years, that they're asking leaders to really be cognizant of how culturally intelligent is your organization to work across communities, cultures, and different dimensions of diversity. And so really spending time of increasing your CQ. And so it is close to to get to belonging as an outcome, you have to have a culturally intelligent organization. So that is a concept that came out. And if you have not added it as a part of your associate behaviors or employee behaviors, or an area that is a part of your development, learning and development toolkit, you really need to look at cultural intelligence, CQ. You could be highly culturally intelligent in one community, in one county, and actually go 30 miles or to the next community, the next state, or the next city, and have low CQ and become culturally unintelligent about the community, the customs, the heritage, the race, et cetera. And so cultural intelligence is certainly something I would encourage you to invest in. We don't have a lot of time to talk about that today, but I wanted to see the audience and who we're working with. And so I applaud you for participating in the poll. As we move on to the next slide, I'm going to give you how do we move towards a better tomorrow and best practices. So the next things that I'm going to share with you really relate to some things that I think can lift us out of, and move us into some other ways in other lanes. If you see this bridge here, it is a great sunny day. I spend a lot of time in California. My mother's family is from California, and there you cross a lot of bridges, and you spend a lot of time going from Oakland or San Francisco or wherever you're going on your vacation. So I put this up here to make a point, and this point is connected to a great concept and a great opportunity to help us move forward. This bridge is really talking about how do we move past breaking. If you think about the things that I talked about with race and the roots of bias and microaggressions and the iceberg principle and theory, where disparate impact is a lot greater in the mass that people of color, when they draw their iceberg, than maybe those who don't. We really need to think about how do we bridge to success and not continue to break as a community, as organizations. We're breaking too much, and we continue to break. We lose a lot of ground of rehashing and starting over. So this really helps us think about how do we stay resilient, and it requires us to develop strategies that make us feel safe, that make us matter and belong, and not marginalize individuals or try to fit individuals into a certain hole or square peg kind of thing. So without resilience, without bridging, without safety, without mattering, without a sense of belonging, you cannot move from breaking to bridging successfully. So we cannot perform, we cannot innovate effectively, we can't engage, we can't move forward. And so living and working in environments where we have the freedom to take risk, where we can stretch our and grow, where we can really build as an organization, is what we're talking about here. We have to feel that we can move into togetherness. We have to feel that we are like a team and that we're rowing in the same direction. And again, if we're breaking too much as individuals and organizations, we can't get there. On the next slide, please, there is considerable research to support this. I'm honored to have had the chance to meet the leader of the Othering and Belonging Institute, which is out of UC Berkeley, implicit bias. They do a lot of research. John Powell is his name, an amazing thought leader related to this. You look him up and you can get a lot of information about the 4 areas that they spend time talking about: breaking, bridging, bonding, and belonging. He's been to Kansas City several times to talk about this, and he shares research on how individuals and organizations and even communities can navigate from breaking to belonging. There's a very distinct differences if you understand the bridge that you're on. And so you got to really want to be transparent and want to be real about the facts and the data. You have to understand the current bridge that you stand on in order to build a new bridge. Then you might be able to build a new bridge, and then you might be able to maybe take a different scenic route and not the same one that we've been taking for quite some time. So the breaking, bridging, and belonging is, again, if you really want to move forward, you really need to understand where you are individually. Are you breaking a lot and not building with your bias? Is your organization out of line with diversity, equity, and inclusion practices, policies, and procedures, and you're not aligning those in order to bridge with your diverse associate or employee base to get to belonging? Belonging is an outcome. People want to start with belonging first. You've got to start with what's breaking in your organization and communities to get to. It's a process. It's a process. So the next slide will even further define this. Another gift I'll give you is the deep C model. Oftentimes, individuals don't want to see that there is a breaking point in our communities and organizations. I just work here from 8 to 5. As long as I get from my garage, go to work, and go home, I'm good. I'm putting blinders on. I have filters on. I don't want to see that there are issues or opportunities for in this area. So the past 10 to 12 years, there's been some research done in the deep C area, deep C model. There's a lady that's done, Sarah Taylor, I believe is her name. She has a book about deep C, how people see themselves, how people see others, and how they have seen approaches to this work. And so the question is whether or not individuals and organizations are really willing to see that there are problems or opportunities or efforts that need to be changed. And so we have to have the ability to see, we have to have the ability to understand, and we have to have the ability to consciously shift our paradigm in order to be effective and in this space. And so the seeing approach is one of another thing related to perceptions, interpretations, preferences, selective attention, and so on and so forth. So where do we go from here with this? We have to acknowledge that, again, we have filters and bias. We have to assume greater responsibility. We have to accept differences. We have to detach from those who choose not to do so. And we have to be the change we want to see, let go, leave it behind, and model the behavior. And so the first step in deep C is first seeing yourself. And if you're not willing to see yourself, to say, am I part of the problem? How can I be a part of the solution? Again, we will not be able to move past the past in order to get to a better opportunity. Thank you on that, Renee. Let's go on to the next slide in terms of how do we move together. And so I'm going to end with a couple of things on how we move together, and then I want to open it up to see if there's any questions. So if you have questions for me, certainly put those in chat, or I'll let Greg and team guide you in that process. But it's so important to move together. Moving together is all about taking people where they are and being able to see them for their differences and accepting. So this is a great story. I'm gonna tell this story and end on that, and then we'll see a video right after this. This is a fable. Dr. Roosevelt Thomas, who's an amazing author, one of his books is Building a House for Diversity and Inclusion. So if you want a great read, get that book. And he's no longer with us, but he certainly coined a great fable. And it's about an elephant and a giraffe that live in a community, and they live together. And the giraffe decides to build a new house, and he builds the house according to the specifications of his family. They're tall, they're lean, they're thin, they have different requirements for their house. And so he wants to invite the elephant over to the house, and he invites the elephant over to the house and says, I want you to see my wood making shop. It's in the basement. It's great. I'd love for you to come over. The elephant goes over, but cannot get into the house. And so the giraffe says, I have a solution. I built a garage. The garage has an expandable door. I can certainly push this button and widen the door and you can get in. And he does that. And so the elephant is able to get in the house. And so he's in the house. And so all of a sudden the giraffe gets a phone call. It's from his boss and he needs to go talk with her about a job project that they have a critical deadline. And so he tells the elephant to make yourself at home and look at my hobby, my basement, my wood making shop. And so the elephant says, yes, I will do that. So the elephant starts to walk around and he walks to the left and he actually hears a loud noise and he puts a crack in the wall. And he says, okay, I can't go that way. Let me walk to the right. And so he walks to the right and he actually puts another dent in the wall. And then he says, you know what, I'm just going to have a seat and wait till the giraffe comes downstairs and then I will allow him to show me his house. And so he sits down and of course he cracks the wood bench. So the giraffe comes running down the stairs after the call with his boss and says, you know, I was on my phone with my boss and we were talking and she could hear all the cracking noises and what's going on. And the giraffe was saying that to the elephant and the elephant says, I'm just trying to make myself at home, but I can't. Well, the giraffe says, well, I've got 3 solutions for you. One, why don't you go down to the local gym and take the weight aerobics class, one of the, you know, great classes that they have, weight watchers or weight class, and come back. And the elephant says, I'm not doing that. And then he says, okay, Weight Watchers, what about joining Weight Watchers, lose some weight and then come back to my house? And the elephant says, I'm not doing that either. And then the giraffe goes, one more thing, they have ballet and tap dance on Wednesday or Thursday night. Why don't you go learn how to become light on your feet and then come back to my house and then I can show you the house. And the elephant said, I'm not doing that. And also the elephant said, this house is not built for me. And so I am saying this fable really fast. You might have to read it on your own, but it's a great way to think about how are we building our houses in order to move forward. Are we building our houses that represent our worldview and our position, or are we building the houses and inviting diversity in, inviting equitable solutions in, and inviting inclusive practices and principles? And so you can kind of determine what side of the giraffe represents and the elephant represents in terms of this fable. But I would encourage you to really pause and not focus on how to fit or fix individuals, but how to accept their differences as we go on this diversity and inclusion journey. So let's watch this video and then I'll make concluding remarks and open it up for questions. Let's go straight to the video. Next slide, please. Thank you so much, team, for getting that video going. I hope you enjoyed and learned a little bit about another way that we can move this needle. But as I end my remarks and go to the Q&A portion, I really want us to reflect on there's a multitude of initiatives emerging from both public and private sectors on diversity and inclusion and even equity now. And I would encourage all of us to find our space and how we can advance those and be mindful of those in terms of our organizational initiatives and community initiatives. I think my whole point here today is to make sure that it's not the flavor of the month, that we are looking at seamlessly embedding diversity and inclusion in everything we do. There is no shortage of activities and goodwill. Diversity is a fact, equity is a choice, inclusion is an action, and belonging is an outcome. So we must begin to address and take all of these things into consideration now in order for us to have a bright future for our communities and for our organizations. We can do that. We can become more effective, and we can stay resilient in this lane and in this work. So we need everyone. We need funders, contractors, experts, organizations, advocates, and even anchors to make this happen. Thank you all for doing what you do as Centurions in our communities. And thank you for the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce for advancing this work over each and every year. So I will pause now, and I believe I have several questions in chat, and according to Greg and team, I am to read the questions and then respond to those as needed. So one question, and I'm going to take these in no certain order. One of the questions I have is I'm going to read those, advice for approximately the 50% of organizations that don't have DE&I officer or suite. How can we help sell that to our C-suite? So I think one of the first things that we can do, the HR office is a great office to really start onboarding diversity and inclusion efforts. You can do a couple of things for that, is to develop a business case strategy. What is the business case for diversity and inclusion in your industry? Even collect best practice stories and examples of organizations that are in your industry that are doing great things, and how that's leveraged talent for them, how that's leveraged workforce, marketplace, community outreach, and other efforts for them. So that the HR leaders and team have an opportunity and maybe even obligation to tie how diversity and inclusion can be the next best practice for that organization. So that's number one. And then number two, I think what really could be done is that maybe looking at your current practices and how can you seamlessly start weaving in diversity and inclusion without having a person or an office. You can have someone that has 10, 20, 30% of their role assigned for advancing diversity and inclusion. Where's diversity in your orientation? Do you have any message about diversity, inclusion in your orientation programs as you onboard? Look at your training programs. Is there diversity and inclusion element? Can you bring in outside speakers or have a book club on diversity and inclusion? How can you start small to go big if you're not able to move into this space right away? So I'm going to stop there because we have several other questions. Hopefully that giving you some advice for the C-suite is developing a best practice strategy that you can show and tell to your C-suite, your CEO, the importance of why diversity is there. It says, another question, what tools and resources do you recommend for building CQ? So cultural intelligence is all about the heart, the head, the mind, and the spirit. And I would say the tool, and there's some great books out there, David Livermore, I believe, who I've heard speak on this, and I think is one of the founding authors of this work, talks a lot about 4 areas for cultural intelligence and building in competencies for cultural intelligence. Cultural intelligence comes after emotional intelligence. So when you look at IQ and SQ, which is social intelligence, and EQ, emotional intelligence. Cultural intelligence picks up after emotional intelligence. So in order to be highly effective in CQ, you have to be highly effective in emotional intelligence, empathy, sympathy, inclusive principles and practices. And so there are some books out there. There is actually an assessment. There's a free assessment on cultural intelligence that you can take as an organization, as individuals, and build from there. And then from there, it gives you 4 areas that you should work on to build capacity. The next question is, when you said the millennials are looking for DE&I and putting in apps to job opportunities to see if organizations are progressive, how do they judge whether the organization is meeting what they want? A couple of things, I think. I'll take the first part of this, and there's 2 other pieces. The first thing is, if you have a diversity and inclusion annual report, it really will define the activities and initiatives, not just a statement that you have a statement, but that you can back that up on your sites to see how engaged is that organization in the community from a charitable, philanthropic, or giving perspective. Are they doing things in communities of color as well? Or are they doing things with women or other dimensions of diversity, persons with disabilities, et cetera? So you've got to make sure that you're putting pictures and strategies and initiatives that really go deep and not scratch the surface. The other thing that I see is that people are asking questions in the interview process. Tell me about your diversity and inclusion office or practices. And if you're not able to back that up with your recruiters at fairs or career fairs, or even in the interview process, you may miss talent. So I think you have to put out there on your web links, your .coms, your annual reports, your newsletters. You've got to share that broadly with your communities, external, et cetera. And again, I'm going to stop there because there are more questions. The other one is, are they looking at org charts to see demographic makeup of leadership? Absolutely. They're looking at your board, they're looking at your executive team, and maybe your top those who report to the CEO. So if they don't see gender diversity and even ethnic and racial diversity in the board level, the C-suite level, and those direct reports to the C-level, there are potential opportunities and of them not selecting. They may select your company, but they may not stay. They may not stay long enough to be retained 5, 7, 8, 10 years. And then the last question on this, or are they asking specifically how organizations participate? Internally, you need to take care of your house first. If you are doing too much externally and you can't back that up internally with DE&I practices, then I think you are creating a false image, similar to the draft. You can come into my house. Oh, my house is beautiful on the outside, but when you get inside, it's not a good fit or fix, if you will, for those who are diverse. So I think it's important that you must take care of your internal practices, or balance both. You can do external and internal initiatives at the same time, but it's really critically important that your internal far exceeds your external or grows faster and gradually beyond your external giving. Window dressing is not what we want. That is great, but when I open the door to the store or the house and I go in and there's still a cracked foundation, we need work. All of us have opportunities and all of us have issues in this space. Every organization is trying to achieve greatness in this area. So it's a work in progress, it's a journey. We have to just get started. Over the last 2 years at Cerner, what have been the most difficult D&I related issue you have tackled, and what do you think we could learn about that experience? So for those of you who know, I am the first diversity and inclusion executive at Cerner. So that was one. That's probably the new CEO, Brent Schaefer, came in 3 years ago and really set charge on where is the diversity office and lead her. And that is, at that point in time, that was the difficult issue of tackling, getting that office ready and adopted. And I think the difficult issue for Cerner isn't that we have the support from the board the CEO, the CHRO, I am very pleased to announce our executive engagement in this space. Now we need to work on the associate base in terms of engagement and accountability and ownership. And then also not just having a US focus, but because we're in 26 countries and more, the associates that are in our other regions and locations, diversity and inclusion means different things to them. So ensuring that we onboard a practice and policy and approach that is inviting for all area. But we're starting. We're brand new in a strategic, seamlessly embedding across our organization. And so hopefully a year or two from now, you can come back and ask me this question. But I am very pleased to announce today, as an example, the Hrc Index just came out, and we 4 years in a row for LGBT equality have received 100 on that score. And so to be a part of joining the organization in 2018 and now today to still see that we're doing some great things in the midst of our journey, I'm proud to share that news as well. So thank you for that. Greg, I'm going to go to you to see, did I miss a question? Are we good with all the questions? Oh, here. Who is the speaker you mentioned regarding breaking, bridging, and belonging? John Powell. John Powell is with UC Berkeley. He is out of the Othering and Belonging Institute. Amazing concept about how we look at each other. So those are some of the questions that we have. So I'm going to end there. I know you have a great day ahead of you. I just want to say thank you for allowing me to be here. This is a journey, not a sprint, but we have to get started. We have to stay committed, and we need all of you to move forward in this work. So without further ado, I'm going to end my remarks and turn it back over to your leader. Thank you.
Wow, just wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Hendricks. While I can't speak for everyone here, I know that much of what you said will stay with me for a very long time. Being part of the Centurions leadership program has opened my eyes in ways I never could have imagined. My husband always knows when a Centurions learning opportunity has greatly impacted me. The clue is a text from me saying, when I get home, we're going to check our privilege. And without a doubt, we will be doing that in our household tonight. Up next, we have our breakout sessions. You may remember noting your preference when you registered for today's event. And while we did our absolute best to put everyone in their preferred breakout room, we did assign them on a first-come, first-served basis. But fear not, once you get into your breakout room, actually, you're already there, we will play a teaser of each of the 4 themes. And after today, we will be providing a recording of the full discussions for you to view at your leisure. So even if you didn't get your preferred breakout, there will still be a chance for you to see it, as well as the other amazing content from today. Think of it as your own personal DEI Netflix. So without further ado, let's roll the tapes.
Hi, my name is Faisal Khan. I am the CEO of the Samuel U. Rogers Health Center located here in Kansas City. We are a federally qualified health center that provides primary healthcare and dental healthcare services to 25,000 residents in the greater Kansas City area. Continuing the mission of our founder, the great Dr. Samuel U. Rogers, from the 1950s and 60s onwards, we completed our 50-year journey in 2018. And as we take a look around today, the pandemic has exposed several fault lines that we knew already existed in terms of disparities in the greater Kansas City area, would pretty much mirror what exists in other metro areas across the country. This is an issue of existential importance to the people of Kansas City. We cannot be a prosperous region until we take care of the most vulnerable populations and refuse to simply paper over those fault lines and instead work to address the core issues that create those fault lines and disparities to begin with. Chief amongst them, generational poverty, lack of transportation, lack of healthy and adequate and affordable housing, a lack of access to affordable, nutritious food, and a lack of access to healthcare, not to mention the virtual non-existence of safe, walkable neighborhoods and areas. The Samuel U. Rogers Health Center is one major part of the safety net in the Kansas City area that seeks to address some of these disparities together. One of the things that we are focused on most is getting people back into care. The pandemic has left people fearful, justifiably so. People have dropped out of care. People have refused to show up for medical appointments out of fear of contracting the virus. And all of those things go together in determining the downward spiral in health status outcomes across the greater Kansas City area. We have our work cut out for us in the years ahead. Realistically, it will take at least 5 to 10 years of hard, focused work before we're able to be in a position that we can look back and say, we did everything we possibly could to mitigate the devastating after effects of the pandemic. And I look forward to having this discussion with the audience and highlighting some of the work that we have done in the greater Kansas City area, particularly in the neighborhood that we reside in, the northeast part of Kansas City, to address some of these disparities. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jeff Simon. I am an attorney and the office managing partner with the Hush Blackwell, a law firm here in Kansas City. And I feel very fortunate to have the chance to have a dialogue on the topic of creating allies through chaos. I don't think it's going to come as news to everyone that 2020 has been a mess of a year. Chaos is the way to describe it. In fact, I just heard Ken Burns interviewed, and he said he thinks it's the greatest crisis the country's ever faced. And the other three were the Civil War, the Depression, and World War II. We need to bring order out of this chaos, right? And one of the fundamental problems that's driving the chaos is a lack of understanding one another, and more importantly, lack of even wanting to understand one another. So if we're going to find our way through this, we're going to have to figure out a way to see life from a perspective that may be different than our own. We're going to have to find a way to accept truths that may be uncomfortable for us, truths that we may not want to accept. Okay, and by we, I mean all of us. I mean all of us. There are lots of talkers in this world right now, not near enough listeners. So when we talk about creating allies through chaos, what I'd like to have a dialogue about in our session, and I do mean a dialogue. If you spend 20 minutes listening to me, nobody's going to learn much. But I think if we dialogue with one another, we'll all get something out of it. Is what can we do? If we feel a pull toward wanting to intervene, to step out of our regular life, our regular day-to-day, and try and do something to pull this country together, to pull this world together, to address the very fundamental needs of justice and peace. How are we going to do that? And I feel like a lot of us have that pull, have that desire to be a part of something, but don't really know what to do, don't really know where to begin. I know I certainly have felt that way over the years. And for the last 5 or 6 years, I would say really longer than that. But the last 5 or 6 years, I've tried to, in my own way, in small pieces here and there, try to do some things that might make a difference. And I'm happy to share a little bit of that story with you, only as, a story that might inform and might spark some thoughts in your own life. But I'm much more interested in dialoguing with you as to suggestions you have for me and for everyone else in our group about where you see yourself getting started in creating allies through chaos, and what you think, what your thoughts are on if you're in need of an ally, what it is you're looking for. We all got a lot to learn. I really believe that, in fact, Ken Burns said this in his little interview today. If you study history, there's a lot of darkness, right? But if you look at it the right way, there's a lot of optimism too, because even in the darkest of times, when people of goodwill pull together and resolve to make things better, it happens. It can happen. It does happen. We need that right now. And I hope that we can have a discussion during our breakout session that might be helpful in that regard. So once again, thank you for being here for the conference. I hope some of you will join our breakout session, and I hope you bring your ears and your words to our conversation. So thanks again, Jeff Simon. I'm in the Creating Out of Chaos breakout session. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Maria Morgan, and I will be facilitating the breakout session on diversity, equity, and inclusion in education. I can't wait. I'm excited to have a conversation. I am a licensed attorney who has worked in the field in the areas of equity in education and equity in employment and healthcare all of my career. And I've seen a number of different issues. I also served as a supervisory attorney for the Office for Civil Rights for Department of Education. And there I often supervised resolution agreements and remedies that were provided to provide equity and access in education. So I'm excited about the conversation. Equity in education affects all areas, the familiar areas and areas that folks are not so familiar with. Funding, teacher ratio, teachers of color versus students of color, implicit bias in education. All of those things are areas that we can touch on. So I'm excited for the conversation. Come join us.
Good day, greetings. I'm glad to talk to you a little bit about what we'll be talking about. First of all, my name is Spark Bookhart. I'm the convener of the Parent Power Lab here in Kansas City. And the Parent Power Lab is an active collective of parents that challenge and collaborates with the public education system here in Kansas City for world-class outcomes for children in the system. The failure of public education cannot be understood by listening to the common narrative of public education in Kansas City. And those are the kind of things that I want to talk about in our session. You know, in my humble opinion, the only way to fix public education is to view it through a lens of race, place, and money, and to empower parents to have a significant ownership and involvement in public education. The only thing that's perpetuating the underdevelopment of Kansas City is how we have dealt with public education. We have a backwards way of looking at public education. And if Kansas City fixes that backward way of looking at education, I think we're primed and poised to be a world-class city that rivals, that don't have many rivals. So that's the tenor and tone of my approach to the discussion, and I would love to have you come and converse. Thanks a lot.
Hi, my name is Anita Davis, and the title of my breakout is Rethinking Workforce Development Policies and Practices to Account for Systemic Barriers to Employment. And we'll get into what systemic barriers are, but we recognize that COVID-19 has severely impacted populations that are low wage, Black and Hispanic or Latino, and they've been most negatively impacted. And looking back at the Great Recession, we also understand that Black populations took 10 years to regain the employment numbers that they had prior to the Great Recession. So as we look at economic recovery, the question is, are the current workforce development practices and programs enough to really help individuals that have been disproportionately impacted regain economic mobility and be able to really close those economic gaps so that our communities can really realize regional economic prosperity? So some of the questions that we will discuss and some of the data and the research that I will share with you today will examine what has been the impact of COVID-19 on our occupations and industries and which people have been most negatively impacted by the pandemic in terms of employment. We will also look at our current workforce development practices and look to understand, are these practices enough? What have studies and evaluations shown us about these practices, and are they really moving people into real economic mobility? And we will look to understand what are structural barriers to employment. Those are institutional policies and practices that favor one group while systemically creating barriers to employment for another. And how can we ensure that we have equitable practices in workforce development? What are some best practices and what are some proposed strategies? So if you want to really understand how to move our community towards true regional prosperity, come to my breakout session or watch the video. Thank you.
I don't know about you all, but I'm super energized to listen to each of these breakouts after hearing the passion each of our presenters has on their topics. We'll be sure to get everyone the recordings for all of the sessions early next week. But for now, let's dive into your individual discussions.
Welcome back. For those who don't know me, my name is Davin Gordon, and I'm the Director of Business Development and Advisory Services at AllCap. At the beginning of this session, my DEI co-chair, Kelly, mentioned that I'll be bringing us back together for our final and arguably most important segment, the call to action. I've spent my whole life in Kansas City, growing with this town, and I've had a front row seat to all of the social and economic challenges in my career at AllCap, where we help to provide access to capital to under-resourced businesses and demographics in the Kansas City area. I hope everyone had an opportunity to engage with each other, with our speakers, and have meaningful conversations with each other about the challenges that have faced and continue to face our city, Kansas City. There is no doubt that we have a long and winding road ahead of us in our fight for equity, but I remain encouraged that change is possible because of people like you and days like today. In the age of Zoom fatigue, cabin fever, in a time when the most privileged amongst us can simply close our computers and our eyes to the injustice around us, you decided to show up. You decided to log in, to listen, and to grow with us. You decided today you'd be part of that change. Every day you have a choice. You can wake up and be closed off to the world, tired, unwilling to fight for what is right, or you can choose to do the work, to have the hard conversations, to feel the vulnerable emotions that tell us that we still aren't where we need to be, and to literally take action to make a difference in our community. Today's call to action is simple. My ask is that when you wake up each day, you choose to put in the work. You take action that will make a difference. These actions may look different for everyone. They may be even different each day, and that's okay. For some of us, you may act through volunteering, distributing food to the homeless or beds to those in need. For others, it may be educating yourself on local and state legislation, like the opportunity Kansas has to recognize Indigenous Peoples Day. For many of us, it's reading a news article or admitting to yourself that you have biases that you need to overcome. Some of you will show this by taking the sometimes uncomfortable steps of pausing during a work conversation to call out those microaggressions that plague people day after day. Whatever you choose, however you decide to put this knowledge to work, we just ask that you do. Every day you have that opportunity to wake up and make the right choice. Use that opportunity to do the work needed each and every day until we see equity everywhere around us. Choose to be the person that is willing to fight for what we know is right, and our city, our country, our world will be a better place for it. Just last week, we remembered Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and as we close today, I'd like to remind us of one of his quotes. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. Before I wrap up, I wanted to give a huge thank you and shout out to our planning committee that helped organize today's symposium. I wanted to give a huge shout out to Kelly Roach, William Chakas, Jen Malone, Cameron Meany, Gretchen Fitzgerald, Greg Valdivino, Lindsay Hadkio, Sydney Wycliffe, Laura Dryden, and the entire Kansas City Chamber and Centurions organization. Thank you and have a great day.